5 days away, folks. Notre Dame, Ohio State. It never gets any better than a national championship game, but I got to say this one has a little bit more sparkle to it. The first of the 12-team variety, and of course, two historic giants in the sport. Talking about historic giants in the sport, I got one right next to me. Brian Driscoll, of course, from Irish Breakdown. And Brian, appreciate you being here. I caught your show. This must have been yesterday. And I typically breeze by these shows, and I'm so locked in with what I'm doing, but I could not tear myself away from it. A lot of great analysis. So, folks, when you get done here, if you've yet to check out the Irish Breakdown run this entire week, just binge watch it and listen to the breakdown from Brian in particular. And, of course, Trevor was exceptional as well. Brian, I'm asking how you're doing tonight, knowing what the answer is. So Brian is a gamer. So
rule number 76, no excuses. Play like a champion. So we're here.
Okay. Well, you know what unit on the field has had to play like a champion is this offensive line. So let's start there with this matchup against what has been an Ohio State defensive front that's always had just ridiculous talent, but they are playing out of their minds the last few weeks. I went back because I remember us having the discussion after I watched the Texas A&M game, and I marveled at the gelling of the offensive line in the fourth quarter and taking over that game with a touchdown drive and a field goal drive to win it, and then gaining more admiration when I found out from you and also the broadcast that, man, they were young up front, and then progressing. And I went back and looked at that lineup and how it's played out during the course of the season. Well, most recently, obviously, you've got the injury to Anthony Knapp, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So he's not playing. As I understand, the issue with Rocco Spindler is that he may or may not play. We don't know.
Yeah, it's going to be a week. It's going to be sort of a how does he progress through the week of practice? You know, and he's been battling an ankle injury since the Indiana game. So on Notre Dame's second touchdown drive in the second quarter, they had a play where the center missed the snap count. And so he kind of started before everybody else did. And then that caused kind of a pile up, and Rocco got his ankle turned on. And he tried to gut it out, played until halftime, and then they pulled him at halftime. And so Sam Pendleton finished the game at right guard. And then he battled back against Georgia, and I mean, he was competing his butt off, but you could just tell he didn't quite have the juice in his legs. And then against Penn State, he started the game again, and I mean, Mark, he just had no push off the lower body, just none. Like he just couldn't drive off that lower body. And then he got hurt on the same play. And a lot of people missed this because he got hurt on the same play that Riley Leonard got hurt. And so a lot of people didn't see that Rocco also went out on that play. And then Knapp was already out. So when Notre Dame made their run against Penn State, when they started ripping Penn State up, really from that moment on, they had two backup offensive linemen in the game because Tosh Baker came in the game at left tackle for Knapp, and then Charles Jagasaw came in at right guard. The interesting thing is Knapp stepped into the lineup in the first week of fall camp when Jagasaw got hurt, because Jagasaw was supposed to be the starting left tackle. So it's just been it's been really unreal bad luck for Notre Dame this year when it comes to the offensive line. And the team they're playing on Saturdays had their own fair share of bad luck on the offensive line from an injury standpoint. But yeah, this is, I think, going to be their fifth or sixth lineup change. And this one is primarily due to, I mean, most of these have been primarily due to just guys going down.
So as you mentioned here, yeah, Jagasaw missed the entire regular season with a torn pec. So he can play left tackle or he might play guard. We don't know.
Right. We don't. Because, so they listed Tosh Baker as the starting left tackle with an or by Jagasaw. And then at right guard, they listed Rocco Spindler, and then Jagasaw was right behind him. So I don't know what their plan is. I don't know if they're just like, look, we're just going to go with kind of what we had against Penn State in the second half. It seemed to work. Or if they feel Rocco's good to go, do they think Jagasaw can get enough work at left tackle? Because, I mean, I know he played tackle in the bowl game last year. He was projected to be their starting left tackle. He was their starting left tackle all spring. But since they brought him back for the bowl games or for the playoff games, he's been playing primarily right guard. So has he gotten enough work at tackle in the last couple of weeks to be able to thrive against, Jack Sawyer and JT and, Kenyatta Jackson and the guys are going to be bringing off the edge? That I don't have an answer to. That I don't know.
Did Baker play as poorly as the stats would indicate with the 5 hurries and the
first
sack?
half? Yeah. I mean, think about what Tosh Baker was tasked with on Saturday. He hasn't played a meaningful down since the Florida State game. Comes off the bench cold and is, oh, by the way, you're going to be blocking Dennis Sutton in a mean Vanover. So good luck. I think he had a really hard time handling the speed of those Penn State guys in the first half. I had him down for 5 pressures. I know Pro Football Focus did too, so I can't speak to where they had the breakdown of pressures. But on my breakdown of pressures, I had him down having 5. He had 4 in the first half. He didn't come in the game till the 13-minute mark of the second quarter. I had him as 4 in the second quarter. I only had him for 1 in the second half. And I thought he played better. I mean, did he dominate? Was he great? No, but he held his own. And honestly, that's all they really needed him to do. And that played a big role in why the offense really got rolling. They scored, it was 24 points and had 261 yards of offense in the second half of that game. So, and with these 2 guys in the lineup.
How impressive is the Ohio State defensive line? They bat passes down, Jack Sawyer in particular, but they all have a propensity to do that and know when they're not getting to the quarterback or know that timing of when to get the hands up at the last second. Obviously, they put actual pressure on the quarterback. They've got the push up the middle with Tyleik Williams. He's been exceptional. How good are they versus some of the better ones that you've seen in recent times?
I mean, they're in the conversation for best. I personally like Penn State's a little bit better just because I prefer more athletic line. No, let me rephrase that because Ohio State has an athletic line. I prefer more speed up front, where Ohio State is more power to speed. That's just kind of my cup of tea. So it really comes down to your preference. I prefer an Abdul Carter to a Jack Sawyer type of edge rusher. They're both excellent players. It's not even something, Mark, that I would consider debatable, because if you were to tell me Ohio State was better, I wouldn't debate it. It's like, okay, I mean, they're both excellent. The one good thing for Notre Dame, Mark, is they have played a lot of good defensive lines this year, including in the playoff. I mean, Indiana's got a really good defensive line with the Kamar kid and CJ West. And then, of course, we know Georgia's got the big physical line with Nazir Stackhouse and Michael Williams and Jalen Walker. You go all the way back to the opener against Texas A&M with Nick Scorton and Shamar Turner and that crew. So they have been pretty battle tested. Louisville also has a pretty good defensive line. Notre Dame thought so highly of some of Louisville's defensive line. They went out and got one of their nose tackles in the portal. So in Jared Dawson, but I'll say this is the best coached defensive line, and that goes back to what you were saying before. Why do you have linemen across the board that are batting balls down? Good recruiting. You recruit players with the mind for the game, because that's not a physical skill per se. That's a instinctive thing. You have a mind for the game. You're a smart kid. You've got a good feel. You can get your hands up, and a good coaching to make sure these kids are prepared to, hey, you understand on this particular play at nose tackle, we're not asking you to get to the quarterback. If you win off the line, great. But you've got to secure this gap, make sure this quarterback doesn't take off running, and you get your eyes on him. And when he goes to throw, you get your hands up. That's good coaching, which you expect from a unit that's been coached by Larry Johnson.
These college football playoff games have not been scoring fests for the most part, like we started to see in the 2016, 17, 18 range, 2019, obviously, with the LSU team. Is it a coincidence that maybe the 4 best defenses in the country played in the semifinals?
Yeah. No, I don't think it's a coincidence at all. I mean, I think in this particular season, and I don't know that it's related to the 12-team playoff, I think it's kind of unique to this season. There weren't any like elite offenses this year, in my opinion. There were some that scored a lot of points, but there weren't any elite offenses. You look at Miami and you're like, that's not in the same league as like Bama 20 or Clemson 18, and of course LSU 19. Oregon has a good offense, but let's be honest, we've seen a lot better Oregon offenses than this one. This is a very good offense, but there are some defenses this year that are just outstanding and would be outstanding in any year. Ohio State's defense would be outstanding in a lot of years. It's a very talented, very experienced defense. Notre Dame has a very talented defense. Texas has a very talented, experienced defense. Penn State has a very talented and experienced defense. We can go on and on and on. And I know Indiana's offense got a lot of the credit, but I feel like their 11-1 record was built on the success of the fact that they could flat out play defense. And so I think that's part of it, on top of the fact that this is also a year, it's not a coincidence that I don't think there's really any elite quarterbacks in college football. There's no Joe Burrow, there's no Bryce Young, there's no Tua, no Trevor Lawrence. There's good quarterbacks, but no guys like that. And then some of the best quarterbacks weren't on elite teams. Shador Sanders played at Colorado, not Notre Dame, and Cam Ward played at Miami, and a decent team. He didn't play at Ohio State. I think that factored in as well. And so I think there's a lot of factors that led to that, but I think it's a unique to this season type of thing, more so than this is how it's going to be in the 12-team playoff, because I think we saw that all year in the regular season. That was just the unique thing about this year. There just weren't a lot of great offenses this season. Like, when I mean great, there were outstanding offenses this season. What I mean is like Notre Dame finished 5th in the country in scoring. I look at this Notre Dame offense, and I don't think this is like a typical top 5 scoring offense like we've seen in past years. I don't see that. And then, of course, the team, like you said, the teams that got in, there's a lot of good defenses that got into the playoff. And all the teams with great defenses won, at least their first game or two. A couple of them had to play each other in round 2, Notre Dame against Georgia and, things like that. But, actually, that was the only game of 2 really good defenses, because the others, Arizona State's okay on defense and Boise's okay on defense. Oregon's okay on defense. But we saw in the semifinals, that's 4 of the best defenses in college football, if not the 4 best defenses in college football.
That's where I've got them, those top 4. Riley Leonard has to be effective on the ground, you would think. Is part of his magic his ability to know when to keep it? Now, we saw Will Howard make a few mistakes, one in particular keeping the football against Texas when Quinshon Judkins would have probably taken it to the house. I got to think Riley Leonard's probably more instinctual and just reads the defense better than most quarterbacks.
What's interesting, Mark, is I think Riley Leonard has great vision as a runner, and that's what makes him so effective. And he's a really good decision maker as a scrambler. Notre Dame doesn't actually run a ton of read zone and power read and things like that, because I don't think Riley is a great decision maker in the read zone. I think because his tendency is to keep it. Like, so when I coach quarterbacks and running backs in college, when we would run read zone stuff, the rule was basically give unless. Like, your thought process is, I'm giving unless this happens and makes me not give it. I think with Riley, it's I'm keeping unless it's obvious, right? And I think there were a lot of times he'd make decisions where it's like, dude, you shouldn't have kept it there. So I think eventually they just said, okay, well, when we want you to run the ball, you either scramble or we're going to call you to run the football. They don't run a ton of read zone. Now, maybe that changes against Ohio State. I don't know that you need to do it. I think Ohio State's a pretty good defense against the read zone stuff. They're pretty disciplined in the way that Jim Knowles runs his stunts. I think they handle that stuff pretty well. It's more so their thing is, look, they don't have the dominant offensive line. You're out Cooper Flanagan, who's your best blocking tight end. So instead of running some of the read stuff, the way that they've been able to sort of handle that extra hat in the box is to simply call designed runs to Riley Leonard, where now your running back is getting into the box. Like, that really worked against Georgia. So instead of running some of the double counter stuff, whether it's old school counter tray with the guard and tackle, or you're bringing the guard and the tight end on more of the modern counters, and then now you're leaving your backside unprotected, so you've got to have your quarterback kind of read it or whatever. What they're doing is they're running counter where they'll leave the backside tackle on sort of a gap hinge where he can protect the edge. They pull and kick with the guard, and then Jeremiah Love or Aeneas Williams is now the puller, essentially. They're the lead blocker. So now you can get an extra hat at the point of attack, and then Riley Leonard becomes the ball carrier. That's been their answer to teams getting extra hats in the box as opposed to the read zone. And then, of course, they'll still do RPOs. They still do RPOs, and he's been pretty decent with that decision making. So I think it's just that's more his comfort level. And then once he's got the ball, Marky, he's got a great feel for finding openings and and getting in the, like, one of the big matchups. Ohio State is the number 2 red zone defense in college football. We saw that against Texas. They punked Texas into that toss sweep. They were like, they didn't believe they could score from the 1. Well, who's number 1 red zone touchdown defense? It's Penn State. And we saw in that game against Notre Dame needed 3 plays to get 2 red zone touchdowns against Penn State and a lot of it's because of the Riley Leonard factor. And that and Jeremiah Love's a stud. But it is that they can protect the edges and get that extra hat at the point of attack in the red zone run game, which is why Riley Leonard's put up the rushing touchdown numbers this year that he has.
Brian Driscoll here, Irish Breakdown. Brian gutting it out for us tonight to break down Notre Dame, Ohio State. Of course, the national championship game coming up on Monday. I think most college football nation's pretty happy to see these two on the field. It's a rare occasion, 8 times in history, 6 since 1995. Bo Collins may play in this game.
Yeah, questionable. He's got a calf injury.
He's questionable. Okay. Yeah. We saw Jaden Greathouse post his best numbers ever as a Notre Dame receiver, 7 for 105. You know, how crucial is it that they get something out of those wide receivers? I think some people would be surprised. I was surprised when I set up the matchup against Penn State. It was like these two are a mirror image of each other, except Leonard's the runner, Aller's the prototypical future NFL quarterback, and then Riley Leonard outpassed him.
I think that's the secret recipe. I mean, that's not the secret recipe. That's the very obvious recipe to Notre Dame playing their best football is when they're balanced. That's going to be the big key for this football team. I mean, look, you can beat Georgia throwing for 90 yards because you had a kick return, you had a short field. And honestly, Mark, I mean, said before the game, you probably listened to this. I didn't think Georgia's offense could score on Notre Dame's. With Carson Beck, you know, you're not going to do it with Gunnar Stockton either. This is an elite defense for Notre Dame. And Georgia didn't match up very well against Notre Dame. The only hope they had is they could just lean on the Notre Dame defensive line and without Riley Mills and hope that they could outsize him. But my counter was, yeah, but you've got to be able to handle their athleticism, and they couldn't. And Penn State was a different animal because Penn State had the type of playmakers on offense that Georgia didn't really have, and you knew you were going to need to score, and they did. I mean, obviously struggled a little bit early, but you saw Mike Denbrock come out a lot more aggressive in this game. Didn't work as much in the first half, but I mean, first third down of the game, he's throwing a wheel route, sideline ball to Mitchell Evans for a big play. Hit two slot fades for big plays. You had second drive of the game, 2 plays before the interception, they ran a deep in cut to their slot, Jaden Harrison, and if Abdul Carter doesn't get to Riley Leonard, he hits Jaden Harrison, and there's nobody near him. And then, of course, Riley got a little greedy. He wanted to get that route back, so 2 plays later, he tried to go to it again. This time, Penn State had it covered, and he threw the pick. But and then, of course, you have the play late in the game where Jaden Greathouse, just torches Cam Miller off the line and gets him to fall down and then makes that big play. So they were a lot more aggressive. You had the sluggo to Aeneas Williams in the 3rd round. It was very clear that they felt they needed to do that. And then on film, like that was a matchup that they felt they could have success with. And so getting Mitchell Evans more involved in the pass game, he looked like last year's version of Mitchell Evans. Getting Jaden Greathouse the ball. I wrote an article late in the season, Mark, where I was like, you've got to get Jaden Harrison and Jaden Greathouse especially more involved in the offense. Because you look at his numbers when he's targeted, he's outstanding. It's like almost an 80% completion rate when he's targeted. He's very effective. He gets open a lot. The slot just hasn't been a big part of their passing game when it comes to where Riley looks. They made a concerted effort, obviously, in this game to do that, and we saw Jaden Greathouse reward them, and that's the Jaden Greathouse we saw all spring. And hopefully that can continue. That's going to be the key, though, right? Is this a one-off? This worked against Penn State, or is Riley Leonard and Jaden Greathouse finally getting on the same page? We're going to find that answer out on Monday.
Appreciate you being here at the Voice of College Football. And we've got a Buckeye show coming up on Thursday on the Ohio State channel. That's at noon Eastern time. Are
they going to actually know the Notre Dame names of the Notre Dame players this time?
Yes. So, of course, the Buckeyes and the Irish played in 2021 and 22. One of those matchups, yes, one of my Ohio State panelists made a comment about that who the hell knows who plays for Notre Dame. Yeah, that was I know exactly who said that. I have a certain level of respect for him, but that was not his finest moment.
No.
Ignorant comment. Absolutely. That was more a reflection on the speaker than it was the team itself. We should
They've
all be knowing
played
who plays for
two
Notre Dame.
really good football games. This is what's funny.
Yeah.
When I look in the chat and, Ohio State fans, they've got no chance. And I'm like, maybe I don't know who's going to win this football game. I was like, after watching Notre Dame the last 2 years, you really still think Notre Dame sucks, huh? Okay. Sure. All right. So it is kind of fun. But the way I look at it, Mark, I wrote an article after Ohio State beat Texas. And I said, both of these teams had one bad day. Ohio State against Michigan on November 30th, Notre Dame against Northern Illinois on September 7th. Outside of that, in my opinion, these have been the two best teams really throughout the season in college football. Just consistently the most dominant. I know people point to Texas, and I'm like, Texas had a lot of ugly wins this year. Ohio State had like a bad 2-week stretch on offense against Nebraska and Penn State. Part of that's because Penn State's defense is really good. You know what I mean? And Ohio State's got to move Donovan Jackson out the left tackle because Josh Simmons got hurt against Oregon and all this other kind of stuff. But you really look at front to back, who are the two most consistently dominant teams all year? It's these two teams. And I think that's what excites me about this championship game is because I do believe you got the two best teams in college football. And, I've been on this hill for a while about Notre Dame's a lot better than people think. But Ohio State has proven when they play their game, they can beat anybody. I think Notre Dame has proved the same thing. And so I do think that we're getting the two best teams. And I do like the fact that the two teams that got here didn't catch any quote unquote breaks in the brackets. You know what I mean? Like Ohio State had to beat Tennessee, who a lot of people picked to beat them in the first round. No Neyland North and all that. Then they had to play number 1 Oregon, who beat them. And then they had to play Texas, the SEC runner-up, preseason top 3 team. Notre Dame had to beat Indiana. Some people will say that wasn't as tough a game. But then you got to go play the SEC champ in round 2. Then you've got to go play Penn State in the semis. And so they both had to earn their way to it. And I think it was it's the perfect ending to what has been the first 12-team playoff. And hopefully they play in a good game. And we end this, what has been a really fun season with a really good football game.
My memory of the fan buildup going into both 2022 and 23 that annoyed me, at least from the folks that watch us, is on the Notre Dame side, it was the lack of acknowledgement that Ohio State had been the better program for the past 25 or 30 years.
I know who you're talking about, yeah.
It was more than one person. If it was one person, okay.
I remember the one guy, but yeah, I get where you're going, yeah.
And then the other was that there's no question Notre Dame's going to win these games. Well, that Notre Dame is now the better program and now the better team. Okay, I certainly, especially that second matchup, there's a winner of the game, and then there is an evaluation of the football play. And walking off the field, all of us that have any, honesty about us and any football sense throws up our hands and says, I don't know who the better team is. Went down to the last play of the game at the 1 yard line with 1 second left. Good. I don't know who the best team is. And the issue I had on the Ohio State side was 9 out of every 10 prediction scores that I saw in the chat was 52-3, 56-10. What?
You'll get that again. You'll get that again for this game.
Yes, I've seen them.
I mean, look, this is for Notre Dame. This is still part of the prove it mode, right, Mark? I mean, I said about last year's game that Notre Dame outplayed Ohio State except when it mattered most. And that's the mark of a great team. And you've got to do that and play in those moments in order to be on that level of that tier 1 elite status. And the thing that I've said is like, look, there's a lot of college football fans that fan bases that like to talk trash about Notre Dame. There's only really 3 that I'm going to listen to: Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia. Why? Because Notre Dame hasn't beaten any of those teams in a long time. I mean, they've never beaten Georgia. They haven't beat Ohio State since around the time my grandmother, Pat, was born. And they hadn't beaten Alabama since the 80s. So you have to start proving that you can win those games. And they did that against Georgia. Now you have to do that against Ohio State if you want to be considered an elite team. I think anyone that's being honest and knows football is want to say that Notre Dame has kind of emerged as that top of tier 2, if not kind of broken into the bottom of tier 1. I kind of think you need to win a championship to truly be on tier one. That's my opinion, because all my tier one programs have won in the last 10 to 12 years. But you've at least got to the top. But for people to truly look at this team and say, hey, look, they are a legit powerhouse team, you've got to win more of these games than they have in the past. I mean, what made Lou Holtz a legend? It was the fact that he had an Urban Meyer-esque record against top 10 teams. And every year you felt like, well, this Notre Dame team's got a shot to win a title. Won one title, should have won two, for being honest. Because if you're going to say Notre Dame didn't win 89 because they lost a head-to-head against Miami, even though they beat number one in the Orange Bowl, then you should say, isn't that the reason they should have won it in 93? One of those 2 years, you need to give Notre Dame a championship. But that was the thing, though, Mark, back then, is you go they could beat anybody. You didn't want, there was a stretch where Miami won a title like 3 out of 5 years, and the 2 years they didn't win it, it's because they lost to Notre Dame. That's kind of how they were. And if they want to get back to that, that glory from the past, these are the kind of games you got to win. And, look, they almost won last year, but you don't come to Notre Dame to almost win. Now, that's Brian Kelly talk right there. Well, we didn't lose to Bama as bad as Ohio State did. Okay, you lost by 27, they lost by 28, and you scored a garbage touchdown, right? That's not Notre Dame football. It's, hey, we played that team, we beat that team. And that's what's at stake for them. That's what I'm excited about, is because it really lined up perfectly for Notre Dame, who they played and who they had to beat, for them to be able to say, hey, look, we belong on this stage.
Brian nicely set up my book plug here. 1990s disputed national champions. Look at 1993. It's only 99, folks. And everyone that has commented here, which I'm talking about 50, 75 people, have said, good read, enjoyed it. So you're a college football junkie, give it a look. We break down the 1990s and press it all toward the future. So it's not just a history book. All right, Brian, how much will it hurt if Notre Dame loses this game, making it all the way to this point, considering they didn't just win a national championship 3 years ago or 10 years ago?
Mm-hmm. It'll be disappointing. It doesn't hurt just to lose. I think it to me, it would strike me a lot like when Clemson lost to Bama in 15. It's a great game. Clemson had their chances to win. Bama pulled it out late. They showed that they're still that team, right? Like, you're still not the big dog yet. Good try, but you're not the big dog yet. But you could look at that Clemson roster and be like, they're not going anywhere. You could just say that you could see what they were doing. You could see some of the guys that had committed, and you're like, they're not going anywhere. And, of course, the next year they went out and won a title. I'm not saying Notre Dame's going to go out and win a title next year, but what I am saying is you can look at this football team and see how young it is and be like, they're not going anywhere. What would hurt Notre Dame is if this game ends the way that some of the past big games have ended for them, right? So, like, if you go out and lose this game where you just get rolled like Ohio State got rolled by Bama in 20, or like Ohio State got rolled by Clemson in 2016. I'm using that as an intentional example because apparently Notre Dame's the only team that loses games like that. Then some of the goodwill you gained by beating Georgia and beating Penn State kind of goes out. Yeah, those teams, when you played the really good team, that's when you got beat, right? And that'll be the talking point. But if this is a 4-quarter game and Notre Dame loses, you're going to be heartbroken for the team and for the players. But I don't think it changes the narratives that Notre Dame has kind of destroyed this season. You can't say, though, they haven't won a New Year's Six game in 30 years. Well, they won 2 in a week. You know what I mean? So, they can't beat, the SEC powers. Well, they beat the SEC champ in the playoff in the stadium where they played the SEC championship for a long time. Penn State's a better program than you. Well, no, they're not. So I think a competitive 4-quarter game says that Notre Dame's for real and they're not going anywhere. They get blown out, then I think the narratives kind of come back up. That's kind of how I look at it. I'd say the same thing for Ohio State. If Ohio State loses to Notre Dame in a hard-fought 4-quarter game, I don't want to hear any crap about Ryan Day's no good and he can't win the big game. You had to win plenty of big games to get here. This is a really good football team in Notre Dame. This is a really good football team at Ohio State. And, both of these teams should look back on the season and say, you had a phenomenal year. You had some bumps in the road and some growing pains and some tough games at times, but these are the two best teams in college football for 2024.
Yeah, I find it that everyone who is not intellectually honest, or maybe they are incapable of being that. The big game criteria is only when you when you lose the game, it becomes a big game. That was a big game, but when you win it, oh, that wasn't a big game. They weren't that good.
Loose Emoji said that. Because people say, "Oh, Notre Dame doesn't win any big games," and he'd list all these big games they'd won. And Lou said, "What I learned is Notre Dame only plays in big games and they lose." And I was like, "Yeah, that's very true, very true."
Yeah, for a lot of people, when I really pin them down, it gets to the point where only a national championship game is a big game.
Mhm.
Unless you lose a game, then that's the only big win that you can achieve.
Sure.
Depending on who they're rooting against. Our buddy Jackson Johnson stopping by has a question for Brian. Have people stopped whining about Notre Dame not being in a conference, or will it pull back up in this summer?
It has amped up actually in the postseason, because you have people who just really have no business talking college football. Like, Mark, just because you were a great college football player does not mean you should be talking about college football. And, you got this guy wearing a top hat and a clown outfit, talking about how, Notre Dame's not really that good because they didn't play in a conference. It's like, well, they played one fewer Power 5 team this year than like any other Power 5 conference, but whatever, that's a different conversation. But no, it doesn't ramp. It doesn't go away. And they can beat Georgia, they can beat Penn State, they can beat Ohio State, and it's not going to go away. Because people don't understand why they're independent. Most non-Notre Dame fans, and even some Notre Dame fans, don't understand why they're not independent. I will say this: forget what fans say, because fans are always going to say that Notre Dame should be independent. You have James Franklin making his lame, justification for why they should be independent and all this other nonsense that just made no sense. Like, there's cases to be made for Notre Dame to have to join a conference. His was lame and lazy and just kind of petty. But if Notre Dame wins this game, that's dead from a practical standpoint. There's nothing you can then do to Notre Dame to force them into a conference, in my opinion. Because, look, we gave away playing home. We gave away getting a bye. We gave away getting a top 4 seed. We did this, we did that, and we still went 12-0. We beat the SEC champs. We beat the top. We beat 3 Big Ten teams to get there, and all this other kind of stuff. So why should we have to go to to the Big Ten conference? We beat 3 of their 4 best teams in the postseason. And the only team we didn't beat, we beat the team that beat them. Like, that's the talking point that Notre Dame has if they win a championship. So fans are always going to say what they're going to say. I care more about the power that Notre Dame has when it comes to negotiating their spot in the college football playoff. You win this championship, and I mean, you have now all the leverage when it comes to maintaining your independence.
So my stance on this is that I don't believe that Notre Dame should join a conference because they're not playing a difficult enough schedule, or because just by principle that they should be in a conference. I don't blame in any such way Notre Dame. Of course, they're doing what's best for them, and they're being allowed to do that. There is no structure in place for college football nationally. There's no governing body. There's no commissioner. Therefore, Notre Dame is going to do what they want to do, and they're going to work in the best interest of themselves. I completely would do the same thing. I just, from a structural standpoint, I would like to see all of college football played in the same structure. But my argument isn't that Notre Dame plays some easy schedule or anything like that, because they don't. There are tons of schedules out there that are easier than Notre Dame's from year to year.
I just don't think in a league as big as even the Power 5 that there's a way to get the uniformity that you get in the NFL. And that's kind of where we'll always somewhat disagree.
I don't disagree with you.
Yeah, that's kind of my thing. And so,
yeah, I don't disagree with that, but we would work toward it. But no, it's not going to get to that level. There's too many teams.
Right. I would simply say this. I think if you were going to try to somehow shut Notre Dame out of the playoff or out of a championship, that opportunity was in the 4-team era, in the BCS era. That's when you could have had a leg to stand on to say, well, did they really deserve to be there in 2012? You look at their schedule. Michigan wasn't as good as you thought, and Oklahoma lost 3, whatever the reasons that you came up with. But now in this era where Notre Dame has to win 4 games to win a championship, like that's kind of out the window. Whether you think Notre Dame belonged there or not because of their loss in Northern Illinois, if you're still saying that they didn't belong there, you're just biased or not smart.
Sure.
You're not actually having a grown-up conversation anymore. And so that, like, if Notre Dame would have been 11-1 and lost to Northern Illinois and gotten to a 14 playoff and got smacked in the first round like they always have, then you could be like, listen, this is getting ridiculous. Like at some point in time, they've got to have a weeding out process like all the other Power 5 teams did because they keep getting here and getting smacked. I think that's out the window now with what they did this year. And if they win the championship, and who knows if they will or won't, we'll see how. I think it's going to be a great game on Monday night. Then that's completely out of there. In regards to the opinion of people that matter, fans are always going to feel how they're going to feel about it, right? It doesn't matter. Notre Dame can win the next 4 championships in a row and play the number 1 through 12 team in the regular season, and you're still going to get that. But you're not in the conference, you know what I mean? It's like that's just the reality of it with some. But from a practical standpoint, if they win the championship this year, I think you've seen like they had to prove themselves in the postseason, and that's what I love about this new format. And I was not a 12-team proponent at first, Mark. I was like, play the bowl games and then pick your 4. Go back to the old bowl tie-ins, have the Rose Bowl be the Rose Bowl, and then pick your 4. That was kind of my way of, because then it's kind of like now the 6 or 7 teams that actually are championship caliber, they get to go prove themselves in the bowl game. Some are going to lose, some are going to win, and then you've got your 4 to be a little bit easier. But I love the format because you have to prove yourself now. Does Indiana belong? Well, they belonged, you could argue, but they weren't good enough to be a championship team. Does Tennessee belong? Well, they had their shot to prove it, and they didn't prove it. And the teams that I felt were the best kind of emerged, and we saw them separate themselves. And that's, I had a perfect record in predictions for the playoffs so far. And I don't believe that I did anything earth-shattering.
Me as well.
I didn't think, they were all kind of no-brainers. You know what I mean? Like, and because I think the best teams kind of rose to the top this season.
I gave some thought to Ohio State, Oregon. I gave some thought to Notre Dame, Georgia.
Sure.
I gave some thought to Notre Dame, Penn State. Those are the only 3, and not a lot of thought. But yeah, the 2 of us are 10-0.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing the tie is going to be broken in the championship game.
Sure. Yeah. I know who I'm picking, and I think I know who you're picking.
Which leads us to this, Brian. And by the way, you were the first person that has proposed, that I have heard, that has proposed the 4 teams after the bowls. I've heard the +1. Mm-hmm. And many years that would have been enough, but there are other years where no, we've got the Orange Bowl winner, the Rose, and the Sugar, and we need more than that.
Well, because if you go back to the era that you're talking about, Mark, the late 80s and early 90s, there were years where, like, do we really know who the best is between Florida State, Miami, and Notre Dame and Colorado? You know what I mean? Like in 1989. Okay, Notre Dame lost to Miami down at Miami. Then they beat number 1 Colorado, and I think Miami did they beat Tennessee or Nebraska that year? I can't remember who
in
they
90?
beat. In 89, the end of the 89 season. Was it Tennessee or Nebraska?
They beat
that
Nebraska.
Year. Right. And so then Miami gets the
something
right.
Like that.
So Miami gets the championship that year because of Notre Dame beating Colorado, who was ranked number 1. And so then Miami gets it over Notre Dame because they beat Notre Dame. And then my answer is like, well, okay, but they lost to Florida State, who wasn't as good. And then Florida State beat Nebraska that year. Miami beat Alabama. So I was 0 for 2. They beat number 7 Alabama that year by 8.
You're right. Yeah. That's
and then Notre Dame beat number 1 Colorado by 15. Right. So like to me, when I look at that season, for example, say, dude, could you imagine what a 4-team playoff would have looked like at the end of the year with number 1 seed Miami playing number 4 seed Colorado and number 2 seed Notre Dame playing number 3 seed Florida State? And let's see who the best team is. You know what I mean? Whereas if it would have been pick your 1-2, it would have been, what would it have been? Rematch of Notre Dame and Miami, right at that point in time, and but Florida State would have been like, hold on a second. We beat Miami.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And so that's why I felt like the 4+2, I think, would make a lot of sense. Because let's be real, Mark. There's never a year where there's more than 6 or 7 at the very most. But usually it's sometimes 2 or 3, sometimes 5 or 6. I think this is one of those years where I felt there were 6 teams that had a legitimate shot to win it.
Yep.
Looking back, I would add Penn State because they actually impressed me this postseason. They did, including the Big Ten title game. You know, I've rang the bell that Penn State was not as good as Notre Dame. I still believe that, but the gap is not as great as I thought based on what they did against Oregon, how they battled back in that game, and then how they handled SMU, who I think is a good football team, how they handled Boise State, who I think is a good football team, and how they battled against Notre Dame. And it wasn't that they choked the game away like some people think. That was 2 great football teams. Notre Dame was just better, in my opinion, and you saw that finally come late. But, you know, to me, this is a rare year where there's, you know, and I felt it was Texas, Oregon, Ohio State, Notre Dame, Georgia were like the 5 that I felt had a legitimate shot to win it. And then Penn State would be next. I'd throw Penn State in there now after having seen them play live and in person. But it's rare that it's this many. It's I mean, in the 14 playoff, there was a lot of years where there weren't 4 that like had a legitimate shot to win it all. There weren't 4. Sometimes there was like, let's be honest, it's going to be these 2. Let's be real. Yeah. It's going to be these 2.
2019 Oklahoma.
Right. I mean, they had no business being in there. 2020 Notre Dame had no business being in there. Well, let me rephrase. They were one of the 4 best teams, but they were not a team that you looked at and said they can compete for a title. And you said, well, they beat Clemson without Trevor Lawrence, without Mike Jones, without, you know, their D tackle, without one of their, you know, because of COVID and all. You look at there's been just very few years where you felt like there's 4 teams that if they get hot could win it all.
Yeah.
And that's why I felt like the bowl system would kind of weed some of those teams out and you'd have a more legitimate 4. And then we'd be ending the season about the same time we are now. Play the games on the 31st and the 1st. And then a week later on the 9th, you play your 4 semifinal games. And on the 20th, you play your championship game. That's kind of how I looked at it.
I'm still kicking myself for not coming up with Alabama because I knew that.
Well, I know that like Miami played Nebraska, Tennessee, Alabama, like all in a short period of time in the bowl.
I remember those games better than I remember last week's games. But, 33-25. That Bama team won the SEC and they were 10-0, but they lost to Auburn, but still were the SEC winner. And then they played in the Sugar Bowl.
Yeah. And Tennessee was a really good team that year too.
Yeah.
You know, they lost Alabama, but, you know, they had a big win over Auburn. They beat UCLA on the road that year. I mean, there were some good teams back then.
Yeah.
But even then, though, there were still usually only 3 or 4 teams that you looked at and said, they're a championship team. They could win it all in a playoff type of format.
Yeah. And to your original point, man, Lou Holtz brought about 5 consecutive years national championship caliber teams to the table. You know, pretty much 6 years in a row.
From 88 to 93, there was really only one team that you probably look at and were like, they probably weren't there. I'd say like that 91 team. They had a lot of injuries. Florida, right? That's the year they beat Florida in the Sugar Bowl. I think they had 3 losses that year. They had some injuries. They had a couple bad losses. That's really the only year of that stretch where they weren't a championship caliber team. Like 1990, Notre Dame could have beat anybody. And that's a team that lost 3 games. 1991 team was not that team. But even then, I mean, they lost at number 3 Michigan. They lost to number 13 Tennessee in a come from behind victory at home. They got smacked by Penn State. I mean, you could tell that team wasn't as good as some other Notre Dame teams. But like that 92 Notre Dame team that went 10-1-1, they tied Michigan and then lost a Bill Walsh Stanford team. Like that team showed how good they were late in the year when they beat number 9 BC by 47 and then beat number 4 A&M by 25 in a bowl game. That was that Jerome Bettis, Reggie Brooks year.
Yeah.
You know, but I mean, a 4-team playoff would have been fun back then. But yeah, that would have it's a little different era back then.
The last thing I need to get out of you, Brian, is obviously we dissected the Notre Dame offense versus the Ohio State defense. So we'll just kind of size this one down and not go through everything possible. But obviously, what catches people's attention that know anything about these two teams is, I don't know if we had the conversation because we didn't talk prior to the Penn State game, but my thought was these are mirror images of each other, except Aller's the passer, Leonard's more of the runner. Here, it's very similar on defense in regards to not necessarily scheme, but just quality of all three tiers. Offensive lines are beat up, but dealing with it. Tandems at running back that are maybe the two best in college football, certainly two at the top 3 or 4, et cetera, et cetera. The distinguishing point, you know what I'm getting at,
Receiver.
Ohio State explosiveness, wide receiver play, and what they could do against the secondary that I think covers as well as anyone in college football.
That's going to be the key for Notre Dame. Obviously, we saw that the last 2 years. I mean, Ohio State, this isn't the first year Ohio State's had great receivers. Like last year, they had Emeka Egbuka. Last year, they had Marvin Harrison Jr. last year. And Notre Dame was able to keep them in check, with the exception until that final drive. When Emeka made that big play on 3rd and 19, and Julian Fleming had a huge 4th down conversion on that drive as well. But that's going to be the key. I mean, this is not a team that you want to get in a shootout against if you're Notre Dame. This is a team that you've got to keep their points down. You got to keep them in the teens and 20s for most of the game. And you can't allow them to have the fast start that they've had in some of their other playoff games. You've got to keep them off the board early and not fall behind, because then that gets you out of your game. But I mean, this Notre Dame team has gone against some very good passing offenses this year. They've more than held their own. They've gone against some very good receivers this season, good offensive lines, and they've proven all year that they're one of the best pass defenses, one of the best defenses in college football. And it's going to be it's not so much can you cover them all day, because I don't care how good you are in the secondary, Mark. If you've got 3.5, 4 seconds to throw every time, you're not. I mean, any good receiving core is going to win if you've got 4 seconds every time you drop back. Somebody's going to win. You've got to pressure Will Howard. I mean, that was really the key for Texas. They did the bracketing of Jeremiah Smith. I think that was overplayed, because what makes this Ohio State pass game so good is you can do that, but you still got to defend Emeka, who had some clutch 3rd down catches. You still got to handle Cardinal Tate, who's at worst the number 2 for 10 or 11 of Ohio State's regular season opponents, if not their number 1. And then, oh, by the way, they like to throw the ball to Travion Henderson out of the backfield. I mean, that's what makes this team dangerous, is that you can do all these things to take Jeremiah Smith out of the game, but you still leave yourself vulnerable. And oh, by the way, they're bringing Brandon Inniss off the bench, who a lot of other teams would love to have in their starting lineup. So, but that's also true last year. And what Notre Dame did last year is they took away a lot of the quicks. They made Ohio State kind of work to get open. And the thought being, by the time they get open, Kyle McCord's getting hit. He's getting pushed out of the pocket. He doesn't have time to throw. And for the most part, that worked. And that's going to be a similar plan this year. And in this matchup is, you've got tall, long corners, especially Leonard Moore, that can run. You've got one of the best safety tandems in college football. You've got a fat group of fast athletic linebackers. It's going to come down to, can the defensive line and the pressure package get to Will Howard? That to me is more important than anything, because if they don't, then the receivers take over the game. If they do, then you're going to force Will Howard into some mistakes, and whether it be turnovers or incompletions or whatever the case may be, and your receivers won't have time to get open. And that's going to be the matchup. When this Notre Dame team is getting after the quarterback, they're really impressive. Go ask Caleb Williams about that, right? I mean, go ask Curtis Rourke about that. He's still having nightmares about Cody Simon and that D line, and he's still having nightmares about Notre Dame and that pass rush and Xavier Watts. And so, that's really what it is, and that's a lot of what Michigan did against them. I mean, number one, Michigan controlled the clock, right, with their own run game, but Will Howard just could never get into it. And there's a lot of problems in that game. The whole game plan and all that, but one of the things they did is they got consistent pressure where Will Howard never felt comfortable in that game to go through his progressions and get to his number 2, number 3 reads. And so he forced his number 1 read a lot more. And that resulted in that offense sputtering. So it's what Penn State did for a time in that game to help keep Ohio State somewhat in check. It's what Notre Dame did last year. It's what Notre Dame did in 2021. But the key is, can you do that while also not letting the running backs gas you and rip you up? And that part, that's what makes it challenging. When they're on, that's what makes it challenging. But the flip side is Ohio State hasn't exactly looked great against the good defenses they've played this year outside of Tennessee. Can Notre Dame replicate that, or is this Ohio State team playing on just a different level than they were in the regular season? And we'll find that out on Monday night.
They both played Purdue, Indiana, and Penn State. Were you able to gain anything from those common opponents matchups?
Well, Notre Dame's offense scored more points per game, averaged more yards per game, and averaged more yard per play against those three teams than Ohio State did. That's just for everybody that thinks Notre Dame's offense sucks. I just wanted to point that one out there. But no, it's really not, because it's all about matchups, Mark, right? And let's just say, okay, Notre Dame may match up better against this opponent, but Ohio State matches up better than that opponent, right? Like, so Notre Dame beat Georgia, who beat Texas twice, who, was about to tell Ohio State. Does that mean that somehow Notre Dame is better through some? And no, it has nothing to do with it. It's about matchups. Texas is a bad matchup against Georgia. They're a finesse team. They're not a physical team. That's what hurt them against Ohio State too, is you can't be finesse against Ohio State. You can't be finesse against Georgia. There's other teams that Penn State would rip up. I think Texas, would have a lot more success against Penn State than they would against Ohio State. Just because the nature, Penn State's defense is more about speed, and Texas can handle that. It's those teams that want to come at you and punch you in the mouth. And not that Ohio State doesn't have speed, but Ohio State's defense is also very physical and aggressive. And Texas doesn't do well against that. So I don't know that you can gain a ton other than by pointing out that, like, look, this Notre Dame team played against those same caliber teams and was just as impressive. What blew me away when I was doing research for this game is Notre Dame and Ohio State combined this season for 27 wins. 23 of those wins were by double digits. They both had 2 games that were decided by single digits. For Ohio State, it was obviously, of their wins, Ohio State, it was obviously Nebraska and Penn State. For Notre Dame, it was Penn State and Louisville. And, it just goes to show that these two teams are real. They both had tough, hard-fought games against Penn State, where Penn State had their shots in the fourth quarter to win the game and couldn't get it done because the defense made stops. Notre Dame's made their deep in their territory. Ohio State made their goal line. And, both of them blew out Purdue. Notre Dame won by 59, Ohio State won by 45, whatever. They both killed Purdue. And they both shut down Indiana. All of Indiana's yards came after Notre Dame was like, all right, it's over. It's 27-3. I think when Notre Dame scored in the fourth quarter, make it 27-3, I think Indiana had something like 90 passing yards in the fourth quarter and had like 150 yards of offense. And then Notre Dame backed off and said, and they got the onside kick and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
They were dominant against those two teams. And then they both went toe-to-toe and battled Penn State, which is part of the reason, Mark, that my respect for Penn State has grown throughout the year, because they did go toe-to-toe with those teams, and they just got beat by better teams. I can't think you can point to those games and be like, well, remember that call that Franklin made, that fourth down against Ohio State, and you're just like, what the heck kind of call was that? I don't know that he had those kind of moments in this game, in this season, in those losses. I think those are just better teams, in my opinion.
And that's where you've got to get past the score. Ohio State handled Indiana eventually, but Notre Dame played a more impressive game against Indiana than Ohio State did.
Early on, for sure, yeah. Christian
Gray, is this guy as Jekyll and Hyde as I think
no,
he is?
He's pretty good. It's just he's a young kid. He has about 2 or 3 plays a game where you're just like, dude, what are you doing? Like the USC game was a bit of an anomaly. Teams have picked on him, and like the go route he gives up to Arian Smith. Everybody remembers that. Well, do you remember Arian Smith doing anything else the rest of that game? No. Go watch the All-22. Why? Because Christian Gray was all over him. It's just it's like left tackles and corners are the same, right? You only recognize a corner when he does either picks it off or he gets burned. That's the only time when you're watching TV you really think of cornerbacks. It's like a left tackle. You don't really think about a left tackle unless it's a great one. You think of a Joe Wald, an Orlando Pace. You recognize those guys, Quentin Nelson as a guard at Notre Dame. But it's just he's had those big plays he's got to eliminate. But he stepped up and played very well against Penn State. I think him and the kid for Ohio State, they like to grab. Christian Gray, not nearly as much as Igbinosun.
Oh, my word.
Christian Gray's got 6 penalties on the season, and the other kid's got 14. He's been called for 14 penalties this year.
I don't know that I've ever seen a cornerback grab and hold, like, and not do it well, not do
No,
it.
no.
It's
Or
obvious.
smart. Like there's times
Yeah,
where it's smart. Like, dude, I'm
sure.
about to give up a 60-yard touchdown. Let me just yank this guy. It's a 15-yard penalty.
Yeah.
But it's not that. It's just, and if we're being honest, Mark, he could probably have another
Yes.
2 or 3 per game. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just like, come on, dude.
When I posted a video this week previewing the game, I said it depends with him how the officials are going to call it. Are they going to let him get away with that or not? Because it's just, it is blatant.
Yeah.
It's bad.
This is
All right,
a good
Brian.
quarterback room, though, at Notre Dame. I mean, and they've proven it all season. And it's going to be a battle. But at the end of the day, it's can you pressure Will Howard? And then for Ohio State, it's can you shut down their run game? If Notre Dame gets their run game going, Notre Dame's going to have some chances to make some plays in this game and put up some points. If they don't, it could get a little dicey. Same thing for Ohio State. If they get controlled at the line of scrimmage, it's going to look a lot like last year's game, in my opinion. I think it's going to be more scoring for both teams this year, just because I think both offenses are better than they were last year. I think both of these defenses are really good. Notre Dame is better than they were last year. Ohio State's definitely better than they were last year, and they were very good last year. But they've jumped to a whole new level with all the experience they've coming back and talent they have coming back, and you're now in year 3 of Jim Knowles' system and all that. But I think both offenses are also better this year than they were last year, just overall. And that's not saying Jeremiah Smith's better than Marvin. It's just as a group, both offenses are a lot better this year than they were last year.
Brian, rest that voice.
Yeah, I know, right?
We want you healthy for the big game, of course, by Monday. And I'm guessing you've got another show coming up.
Yeah, we have shows every day. I've got like 4 different interviews I got to do if people call in. So, yeah. Now, I was thinking about having Trevor come on tonight, but I was like, you know what? It's a championship game. I got to step up and make it happen. We got to be here.
I do appreciate that. You are an excellent analyst and a good guy.
Thank you, sir.
Through and through.
Thank you
Absolutely.
very much.
Thanks for showing up. Appreciate that. And
championship week, Mark. I mean, what kind of Notre Dame guy would I be if a little flu had me, ducking out of interviews? So.
Brought it. Well, please get healthy. Do your best, and we'll be praying for you.
Appreciate you.
And yes, enjoy the ball game. Don't enjoy it too much, though.
Yeah.
And
well, you know me, I'm working during games. We have a post game show afterwards, so yeah, I'll be sitting in my couch. Nerves, sweaty hands, figuring out what's going on, hoping that they can finally get it done. So, yeah, we'll see. It's going to be a good game, I think.
Thanks so much, Brian. We appreciate it. We will just quickly remind everyone here that we've got a Buckeye show with Steve Hellwagon and Tony Girdman coming up on both the Notre Dame and Ohio State channels. That's going to be Thursday at noon Eastern time. And I've got a common opponents video. I've got a historical breakdown, Ohio State against Notre Dame. And we've got all sorts of videos on the Ohio State and Notre Dame channel. So please check those out. And thank you for being here. Hit the like button on the way out. If you're just getting here or you've missed a portion, all you got to do is rewind the video and go to the beginning and catch the analysis from Brian and myself right here at the Voice of College Football. Hit the like button on the way out. We appreciate you, and we will see you soon.